My career as a firefighter lasted for over 10 years, before I finally moved on to a safer, more secure job title. With a wife and a newborn to look after, I decided that it was just a better call to leave the whole firefighting world behind and start my family. So I did. I'm old and retired now, and my kids grew up to have kids of their own, and unfortunately, my wife passed away this last spring. But I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about something that I had experienced as a young man so many years ago. Right out of high school, I decided to join the fire department, which had been a lifelong dream of mine ever since I learned about it back in elementary school. Firefighting had its moments of glory, of course, like saving lives and being thanked by families whose homes you just saved. But not every story has a happy ending. Sometimes there were people who couldn't be saved, and you had to stand there, trying to extinguish the building while the screams of someone trapped inside echoed through the flames. Sometimes the cleanup crew would find bodies melted into the furniture and floors of the building, leaving nothing behind but the hollow husks of what used to be a human. And you would pray that the smoke had gotten to them first, so that they didn't have to face such an agonizing death of being burnt alive. These are stories for another time, however. What I've really come here to talk about is something, or someone rather, that I've only heard about a handful of times throughout my long career as a firefighter. Someone that I like to refer to as the Burning Man. During my first year as a fireman, my station got a call around 3 o'clock in the morning involving a house fire that was only a little ways away from our station. The person who called was a neighbor, and she informed us that the only person living in the house was an elderly man around 60 years of age. We arrived at the house, only to find that almost all of it was already up in flames. We got to work immediately, but the old man wasn't seen leaving the building. So we all silently assumed the worst and figured he had already succumbed to the fire. As we began hosing the house with water, the front door of the building shot open, releasing a large cloud of thick, black smoke. And through it, emerged the elderly man. I was the first to reach the old man, so I quickly threw him over my shoulder and carried him out of harm's way, where the on-site EMTs put him in the back of an ambulance to be taken to the hospital. I hadn't gotten a good look at the old man before he was taken away, but from the short amount of time that I had seen him, he didn't appear to have any burn marks anywhere on his body, even though he had just emerged from a building that was completely engulfed in flames. Now wasn't the time for questions, however, so I got back to work and we eventually got the fire under control. After my team and I arrived back at the station, the chief informed us that he had just spoken with hospital staff and was happy to tell us that the elderly man was in stable condition and was going to make it, only suffering minor burns and some smoke inhalation. The chief also told us that the man, who I later found out was named Harold, wanted to speak to the man who pulled him from the building. Everyone immediately looked to me, but I informed them that I had nothing to do with Harold's miraculous escape from the burning house. I told him that he had managed to free himself and that I carried him to the ambulance afterwards. The chief seemed to believe me, but he still asked that I go and visit Harold in the morning, just to see how he was doing. The next day, I visited the hospital and was directed by a nurse to where Harold was being kept. When I entered the room, I saw he was sitting up in bed reading a book, and looked to be in excellent condition, besides a few bandages that were wrapped around his arms and legs. He looked over towards me and greeted me with a nice, wide smile, obviously recognizing me from the night before. I sat down in the chair next to the bed as the nurse checked a few of the instruments hooked up to Harold. Seeming satisfied with everything, the nurse exited the room, leaving us alone together. We sat there for a while, not saying anything, as several seconds of uncomfortable silence filled the room, until I finally decided to speak. "You look great," I said, looking over his almost completely unburnt body. "I honestly have no idea how you managed to get free from that house without a single third-degree burn." "I know," he said, laughing happily. "It's a miracle, but I didn't do it alone now, did I?" With that, he gave me a wink. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair and decided to just come out and say it. "I didn't pull you from that house," I said softly. "By the time my team arrived, the building was far too unsafe for anyone to enter." Harold gave me a surprised but understanding look. "I know you didn't pull me from my house," he said. "You were the young man who carried me to the ambulance after that older gentleman threw me through the front door." I was too confused to say anything, so Harold continued. "That brave gentleman sacrificed his life to save mine. I do hope that he made it out all right, but from all the burn marks on his body, I wasn't too sure that he would." "I'm sorry," I said, interrupting him. "But did you say that there was another man in that house with you?" I must have been giving him such a bewildered look because his face changed to that of concern. "Well, surely you guys must have known," he said. "I figured that he was part of your crew, given that he was wearing a fireman's uniform and everything." "I'm sorry, Harold, but you must be mistaken. None of us entered that building when we arrived. My men and I searched through the rubble of that house and didn't come across any human remains. Even in a fire as fierce as the one last night, there would still be something left behind. Teeth, most likely, but we never found any. Are you sure there was someone else in there with you? Are you sure he was wearing a firefighter's jacket?" "I'm positive that someone carried me out of that building," Harold said firmly. "I can remember that man's features perfectly. It'd be hard not to remember, honestly. I was asleep on the second floor of the house when the fire started. By the time I woke up, most of the first floor was already ablaze. The smoke upstairs was so intense that I began to feel lightheaded almost immediately. I thought for sure that I was going to die up there, and I must have passed out at some point because when I came to, I was being carried out of my room by this very broad man wearing a burnt and tattered firefighter's jacket. I looked towards my rescuer's face and I almost screamed. Sincerely. His skin covering his head and most of his body had these horrible burn marks all through them. The burns were oddly colored scar tissue and made his facial features be all garbled up, giving him this ghastly appearance. He looked like something you would see from a nightmare, and at first I was really scared that this man was carrying me." There was a long pause before Harold continued. "And then he spoke," Harold said softly. I could see tears forming around his eyes, but he held them back. "He spoke with one of the most angelic voices I've ever heard. When I heard this man's voice, it was almost like the fire around us was no longer there. He had a deep, yet reassuring tone when he talked that calmed me down instantly and made me feel safe. He whispered to me saying that everything was going to be okay and that I was going to be out of this fire in no time." At this point, Harold stopped talking and was looking off into the distance like he was remembering the whole thing, reliving it all over again. I was left in awe, but had more questions than answers at this point. "Even with that man's help, Harold," I said, snapping him out of his trance, "there's no way that he could have gotten you out of there completely unburned. There's just no possible way." Harold smiled at me as he wiped his eyes. "But he did manage to do it. he told me. I don't know how. I don't think I'll ever know how, but it felt like there was this force field around us when he was carrying me through the fire. Harold shrugged his shoulders. I don't know how he did it, but I sure am grateful. We talked for a little bit longer, but my mind was completely focused on this imaginary man that Harold said saved him. I was certain that there was no one else in that house with him, no matter how many details Harold could recall. I mentioned this to my chief, who immediately got a cleanup crew together to recheck the rubble that was left from the fire. I was part of the team, but again, we found no sign of human remains. The chief and other firefighters were skeptical about Harold's story, and just chalked up this imaginary man as a hallucination that Harold saw because of the smoke inhalation that he was experiencing. I didn't know who to believe, honestly. The evidence that we found supported the fact that there was no one else in that house with Harold, but whenever he told me that story involving the burning man, I could hear the sincerity in his voice. I could see the truth of it in his eyes, which is why I was so conflicted about the whole scenario. After a while, everyone forgot about Harold and his imaginary savior. Even I began to forget. That was until about 2 years later. We got a call about an apartment fire near our station, in which a young boy was still trapped inside. We set off for it as quick as we could, but by the time we arrived, the fire consumed most of the building. There was a large group of people all huddled around something in front of the apartments, and as all the men got ready to start extinguishing the fire, I went over to the group of people to see what they were looking at. Lying there on the ground, injured but alive, was a young boy that couldn't have been older than 5. It was the boy that had been trapped inside. Someone informed me that he had come walking out of the building only seconds before we arrived, and then fell to the ground coughing. I cleared everybody away and called for the paramedics to come over. They put the young boy on a stretcher to be taken away. When the report came out later that day of what had happened, and how he managed to escape the building, the child said that a man carried him out of the building before the ambulance or the fire trucks showed up. The kid's description of the man lined up perfectly with that of Harold's from 2 years earlier. The tattered fireman's jacket, the terrifying features of the burnt skin, and, above all else, his soothing voice, like that of an angel. And just like before, the cleanup crew didn't find any human remains hidden in the burnt shell of the building afterwards. No one besides me seemed to make the connection between Harold's story and that of the young boy's, but I was blown away by this seemingly supernatural entity that was going around saving people from fires. Over the next few months, I became obsessed with trying to find information about this burning man and his purpose. I spent several hours a day researching old newspapers and other such things to see if there was anything I could learn about him. After several months of searching, I managed to find nothing. Either this was a recently developed anomaly, or no one ever kept records on him in the past. I never thought that I'd run into the burning man again, seeing as how rarely he seemed to show himself. But over the last 8 years of my firefighting career, I managed to hear about him another 5 times. Each occurrence was spaced out in a seemingly random order, having no connections whatsoever, but the circumstances and description of the man were always the same. No one else seemed to catch on to this fictitious man like I did, and I never really brought him up around anybody because I never felt like I needed to. Also, some part of me thought that it probably wasn't what the burning man wanted. As weird as that may sound. He remained an anonymous mystery that was never going to be solved or discovered by anyone but me. And eventually, after I left firefighting for good, my memory of the burning man began to fade away. I hadn't thought about the burning man in what I'm gonna guess has been about 40 years at this point, and I probably would have never thought about him again as long as I lived until about a week ago. Like I mentioned before, my wife died earlier this year, and ever since her passing, I've basically become a recluse. Never leaving my home or bothering to interact socially with anybody. My 3 kids all live out of state, so they don't stop by often. They'll call occasionally just to see how I'm doing, and now that I'm living alone, they've become more concerned about my health and safety. But I've told them that there was nothing to worry about, because I honestly didn't think anything would ever happen to me. One night, while I was watching TV alone in my 3rd floor apartment, I ended up falling asleep on my living room couch, not knowing that a fire had just begun on the floor below mine. I was woken up abruptly by the loud, echoing sirens of a smoke detector going off somewhere in the apartment, and as my eyes shot open to the all-too-familiar smell of burning material filling my nose, smoke began to work its way into my apartment. It's amazing how some things can go from nothing to worry about to worst-case scenario in a matter of seconds. The smoke that had slowly funneled into my room was filling the air. My firefighter training came back to me in an instant, and I immediately got low to try and avoid the worst of the fumes. With my hands on the floor, I could feel the heat rising up from the rooms below, causing the building's interior structure to weaken. As I made my way toward the kitchen where the fire escape was, I could hear the floor that I was crawling on begin to creak as it became unstable. I stood up and jumped back, just as the support beams below me gave way, causing a cave-in and revealing the wall of fire that was now encompassing the entirety of the 2nd floor underneath me. There was a giant hole between me and the fire escape. I was starting to get lightheaded from the smoke as I made my way toward the front door of my apartment. If I was lucky, I could probably make it to the stairs before the fire reached them. I just exited my apartment and was walking towards the stairwell when I collapsed. The smoke was just too intense at that point. My eyes were watering and I was exhaling deep, throaty coughs as the deadly smoke began filling my lungs. I looked toward the stairway about 50 yards ahead of me and all hope drained out of my body. There was no way I was making it out of there. Suddenly, I felt 2 broad arms wrap around my legs and torso and lift me up off the ground. The smoke didn't seem to bother me as much anymore, and the intense heat that I had been feeling come off the flames below me vanished almost completely. I started to move forward as I looked up towards the man that was saving my life. He looked exactly like how everyone described him all those years ago. He was a very big man, that was for sure. He was built like an NFL linebacker and was carrying my 6'2", 250-pound body with very little effort. He was also very grotesque looking. There's really no polite way of saying it. His tattered fireman's jacket was so dirty and burnt that the original yellow-colored fabric of it barely showed through anymore. The burns on his arms and face left behind skin that was pink and charred and raw-looking, causing large boils to form at several spots. And on some parts of his body, the skin was burnt clear off, revealing the bones beneath it. The smoke that was still rising from below caused dark shadows to dance across the man's face, adding even more terror to his already monstrous appearance. Even though I've had him described to me several times before this in great detail, nothing really prepared me for how he looked in real life. And I'll be honest in saying that, at first, I was scared of the Burning Man. And that's when he spoke. I've never heard a voice as beautiful as his. It was like silk, and every word that flowed into my ears gave me an overwhelming sense of comfort. And in the midst of everything happening around us, I felt safe. "Everything's going to be all right," he whispered in a deep, angelic voice. "We'll be out of here in no time." I was still lightheaded from all the smoke, and I felt like I was on the verge of passing out. But I managed to get out the one question that had been weighing on my mind ever since I first heard about this man over 50 years ago. "Who are you?" I asked softly. I wish I could tell you that he explained everything about himself. Like how he came to be, how long he had been around, and what he was doing saving people from fires. But he didn't answer me. I looked around us and saw that we were already on the first floor, which was completely covered in an orange and yellow blanket of flame. We started walking towards the fire and I shuddered. "It's all right," came the voice. "The flames can't hurt us." And he was right. We were walking through that wall of fire, yet I wasn't being burned. "Almost there," the burning man said quietly. "Just a few more feet and you'll be free." We reached the front entrance and I felt his arms leave my body as I was flung outside into the cool night air. I don't remember when or where, but I eventually passed out. I woke up a few hours later in a hospital bed with an oxygen mask over my mouth, but no worse for the wear. The nurse told me everything was going to be okay and said that my kids were already contacted on their way here. I managed to make a full recovery, only suffering minor burns and smoke inhalation just like those before me. Everyone told me that it was a miracle that I made it out of that building alive, all by myself. And while it was definitely a miracle, I knew that escaping that fire wasn't my doing. I never mentioned the burning man to anybody because I didn't really see a point in doing so. No one would believe me, and I figured the burning man would like to remain a mystery. I still don't know who he is or why he does what he does, but it definitely makes me feel better knowing that there's a man out there saving lives and protecting people from harm's way. I can sleep soundly at night knowing there is a hero out there amongst the flames. A hero known as the Burning Man.